and after I said I would talk about this, I felt very intimidated because I'm not an expert on conflict resolution. I'm not even a trained group facilitator. My getting into this work very much came from the personal story and where I am and what I believe and what can be done and what responsibility lies in Israel and Palestine for us. And also, this is we're on a Zoom call. I have little boxes to see who's in the room, but this is an incredibly charged topic, and I'd say one of the things that I would immediately reflect from Israel-Palestine about approaching these issues is that these are not intellectual issues. They're not political conversations. For many people, they're very much tied with their own very deep traumas of who we are and our skin, what we've gone through, and traumatic experiences. And even in that, saying that here, I don't, who in the call is a person of color, is faced what that means in America. I make this also imagine people from across the world here. But that, to go into these conversations, even here with a group of Israelis and Palestinians, it's one thing we want to talk about peace, we want to talk about an end to the conflict. We never know who's in the room. And we never know what people in the room have gone through. And that's clearly got to be one of the first, I think, lessons that I'd even put out here before this is my disclaimer, but we never know who's in the room and what they've gone through. And that's something to be very aware of, because the level below the political issue is the very deeply personal issue. And a lot of times it's pain, and it's deep pain, and it's things that have gone for a long time. And when we talk about race in America, we're immediately touching on things that people are coming to the conversation with a lot. So like I said, I was feeling a little bit intimidated about how to even open this conversation. I'm going to base myself on looking through the blocks here to see how people react. But last week, I got a little bit of assistance. There's an organization called Beit of Hope, the B8, the House of Hope. It's 4 Muslims and 4 Jews who live in Geneva, who have been some of our supporters. And an intern of theirs wanted to interview people from Roots to understand how to better to support what's going with the organization. I hope she's on the call. She said she's going to be here, Destiny. And we started chatting. She's a student at Columbia, I think. And she's an African-American woman living in New York. And she came to Roots last year as part of a trip to Israel-Palestine to understand what's going on in the conflict. And she said, so she asked me to interview questions about how does Roots feel about what's going on with us. And I said afterwards, I said, I'm supposed to do this talk about race relations in the States. And one of the things she said to me was, coming to Roots was such an inspiration. Of all the places we visited in Israel-Palestine, the visit with you guys sitting there directly brought me back to what's going on in the States and the work of racial justice and against racism. And so a few things that I wanted to say was the ability to hold this conversation, to bring these two parties that are at opposite ends of the spectrum a conversation between enemies, and to manage to find a partnership there, or even open up a conversation there. It's clearly at the core of what Roots is doing. And the chance to then, and I also want to say, there's also a lot of differences, a lot of big differences, and we could spend there's lots of analysis to talk about why the conflict in Israel-Palestine is so different from the question of racial justice in America. To start with a few things, in America, everybody are citizens. In the US, it's a question of citizens. It's a question of equal rights between citizens. Here, we don't know we're supposed to be citizens of the same country. That would be a one-state solution. Many people are opposed to one-state solution and think we really shouldn't be, we should be citizens of separate countries. So even there's a lot of the basics that we're standing on in both sides are very different. The history going behind this, the context, American society versus Jewish and Muslim and Arab and Israeli society are very different cultures. So there's a lot to point out why what works here, really, how could it have anything to bear on what's going on over there and vice versa? At the same time, I did agree to the talk, so I hope I came up with a few points that I think maybe are there. But I wanted to, I don't know how to do a survey while we're chatting on Zoom. but I was thinking about on the call, just of who's here, how many people here on the call, I'll just, we can answer for ourselves in our heart. How many people here feel actively engaged in the struggle for racial justice in the United States? How many people see the need for activism? Which I think, how many people call themselves an activist? But if we go a step back, but I think recent polls in the US are showing many people agree that there's a need for change. You know, is that change then policy? Is it change in society? And once we start examining, you know, or is it not, there's no, or the need is for such a sweeping change that the reforms, without some kind of basic deep reset of the whole system, will never do justice to what we really want to see on that level of equality that we're seeking. And a person can fall out in any of those places, and a person can fall on the other side and say there's no problem, you know, all these different things. I think I'm going to a little bit speak to the crowd that at least is sitting there, there's a need for change. There's a need for change. And the change needs to happen, obviously, on so many different levels. And that's one of the, thinking about where we are right now and how do we move forward, there's so many different levels of work that need to go on. I think one of the challenges in Roots, and to this day, where, you know, people sense there's something wrong. People know there's something wrong. This picture of what life is here is clearly not the dream for Israelis or Palestinians of what's supposed to be. So I think once you get on the page of things need to change, there's already a common ground to work from. But then what's the goal? How do you develop a theory of change? And different people will examine that in different ways. I think we can't talk about addressing the racial issues in America without talking about economic issues. But is that a world that I'm involved in, that I have what to offer in? So I'm going to make the broadest sense of activism here, but I'm going to include all the different levels of activism, from bringing children to meet each other from different cultures and understand difference, from people who are thinking about government policies, thinking of the talk about, you know, the talk about reparations, the talk about restorative justice, and all the levels in between, from police trainings to questions of what does America mean, to questions of addressing our own nationalism, our own sense of what it means to be an American, the questions of identities and how they come to play in this project called America, it's the US. And all of those aspects, I think, have a role. Now, being its roots, we're a grassroots initiative. We're working within civil society. We've made that choice. And it's not an easy choice, really, because if the work within civil society of people-to-people work in a conflict, which everybody agrees needs a political solution, needs political change. Are you addressing the conflict? Are you not sidestepping the conflict by just working on that level? That's a tension that's present in Roots in all of our time, and it can be a debilitating question. Meaning, with the level of pain and injustice and lack of rights, and I could be talking about either place here. What are you talking about bringing kids to play together? You know, we need radical reform. We need a political movement, and that's true. And so one thing I think about, the thing we've had to learn, and I think are still very deeply learning at Roots, is deciding where our agency is, where we have power to do what we can do. I think another similarity between the Israel-Palestine issue and the question of racism and racial justice, I don't even know what the right title is. That's how I'm not exactly in the American conversation right now. But they're both very long, painful processes that have been going on for a long time. They're long conflicts. And if slavery ended 140 years, 160 years ago, if slavery began, if Jim Crow, and then civil rights, and there's all these benchmarks we can look at slow progress, and then we erupt and realize in the last weeks how far we have to go. I can only imagine the frustration that exists there, the pain, the hypocrisy. How much patience is it going to take? And And here also in Israel-Palestine, we've had people talking about there's been a peace process for 40 years or 30 years. It seems to have brought very little forward. This conflict has been raging, and it's already generations upon generations. Any American, white or black, of any color, any Israeli or Palestinian today is born into a conflict that's much older than them. And they're also facing the attempts of previous generations to make change, much of which feels for people like it hasn't worked. So in that face, in the face of that, how do we keep going? How do you not turn down to frustration? Frustration in Israel-Palestine can, it ends up in unilateralism. There is no partner, therefore it's on us to exact whatever we can, If it's through, on the Palestinian side, you said bringing international pressure to force Israel to the table. Saying on the Israeli side to bring unilateral annexation. There's no process left anymore. The process is not bearing fruit. It's time to go to something, or obviously the move to violence. Violence is the only way we're going to control or gain our goals here. So here at Afro, one aspect in which Roots has addressed this, I think there's a few different levels. But one is, I think, I grew up when the environmental movement was strong and it was saying, think globally, act locally. Acting locally. And one of the ways that I think Roots has been able to bring people to the activities is by focusing very locally. And it's true, we can't, the whole big Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a giant issue. It's going to take a long time. But what about in this village right here, in this town right here, with this school, with these kids, on that road, with this, and to roll up our sleeves and get involved in that kind of work. And like I said, how does that change the big picture? Because it gives people a sense that something can be done. It brings people into the process. It brings people into action as opposed to despair or just reading articles and looking how bad it is and saying, here's a place where we can do something. And every group that comes to hear a talk from Roots and Israeli groups that come here, what can we do? Learn the language, learn Arabic, bring your parents' friends back to Roots, bring us to speak in your school, take those small steps and act on them. Begin the process, step into the work, even if it's the smallest steps. But I think, especially with these big issues, some things can feel so disempowering. It's really critical to find the places where we can make a step. I'm going tomorrow with a Palestinian partner of Roots who has a property inside the settlement of Efrat, and they extended a road and it damaged his property, and we're going there to seek reparations, to try to fix. Now, what is this? This is obviously, there's a million systematic things behind this relationship that are wrong, that need fixing. But the fact that he has a group of Israeli settlers who picked up his case and are working with him, first of all, that's a shift. The second thing, using our privilege and our space with the mayor to make that happen, to talk to the army, to make these things happen. But then to write about it, then to post about it, the little bit of getting things going is sometimes what we can do. And I think sometimes at Roots, I know, there's a phrase, there's a teaching in Islam and in Judaism that a person who saves one life is as if they saved an entire world. Okay, I don't think that's enough for a theory of change in terms of how we're going to fix systematic problems, but it's a moral call that's very powerful. And if one Israeli 18-year-old who comes to a session with us and has a different perspective, an understanding of who Palestinians are, is going to take that hesitation before pulling a trigger. If one Palestinian kid who comes to our program is going to know that maybe in those cars driving there is one of those Israeli kids I met and is not going to throw a rock, all those little actions, I think by binding our work to our deep values, if they're religious values or moral values, and to bring that to be the charge, I think that's a way of bringing people in. It's interesting, just now as I'm speaking about it, I'm thinking about the difference of what that means on the side of privilege or the side of lack of privilege. Is that to act from that place of moral? There's something very powerful in charging. Here is, the Israeli who has the power in the conflict to act that moral. It's also something very powerful for a Palestinian to choose to act in that moral, that in my resistance, I'm choosing to take the moral high ground here. And not to fall. We need to think of these ways to address these issues and to come to the activism in a place that maintains some kind of sense of holiness, a sense of power, of moral power there. Let's see what. Okay. I think in these issues as well, we've seen it over and over and over again. People come to a First Roots meeting with a lot of fear about who they are. I can tell you many people come to these meetings afraid they could be attacked while they're there. Israeli parents ask me, is there security? You're bringing 14-year-old kids together. Is there security? Palestinians are coming in an area near the settlements. Are they going to, taxi drivers don't want to drop their friends off to get off the car in this area near the settlements. The level of fear is very powerful. And the level of charge of stepping into any of these meetings. And what happens in a meeting? What happens when you bring these two sides together in a space where you're not just meeting to work, you're in a class together, but you're there to work on the issue, to address racism. It's a very charged meeting in any kind of session. You're here to bring those two sides together. And how are you going to feel? And the fear of everything that's in a cup, a lot of that, what's coming up there is our guilt, everything we bring, our charge, our anger, our fury. This is the one, and I've seen it many times in Roots. The first time you bring an Israeli-Palestinian community, it's the first time they can yell at them for all the things they've caused them, for the rocks they threw on my kids, for the soldier who did this, and the emotional charge that comes up here is very real. And this work is a long process, and it's a long process. And one of the I think phenomena of people who get engaged in anti-racism work and social justice work and any kind of activism is we see something wrong and we want to fix it. And the things we see wrong are not just things, they're systematic things, but they're also things in people. And it's very easy to come up with all that judgment against people, and people feel that judgment. Palestinians who come to a meeting and can feel called a terrorist, Israelis who called here and feel called colonialists or thieves or everything else we throw at each other. And how do you make a space when that's the first encounter somebody faces when they're in that meeting? Are they going to come back to the next meeting? How do we set up a process? I think we have to really lower the bar of entrance to these processes, to this work, and that's a tricky thing to do, because if you're lowering the bar to accept different opinions, does that mean you're allowing those opinions? You're justifying those opinions? If somebody wants to call, if somebody wants to call out the other people with all their bad names at their first meeting, does that mean we allow that to happen there? But to find the space to allow those processes to happen, I think that's a critical part of also what we're trying to do here, and what needs to be done, because a lot of people shy away from the work because it's too much to go into that space where I'm going to be called a racist, I'm going to be called all these different things we're throwing at each other. Boom, boom, boom. Going through my little notes here. I'll go back to something about the kind of different levels of these conflicts. And there's one of the things that Roots works on is transformation. It's on our website. Transformation. Now there's different opinions within Roots about what does that word transformation mean. Is transformation about changing the current status of military occupation, of lack of rights, of no political solution, of all these inequalities into something that's just for both peoples, a political solution? Or is transformation about the anger, fear, hate, mistrust that exists in most Israelis and Palestinians towards each other and transforming them? And And here we have the need to work on both. In America, I think there's a big leg up on the process, maybe in some ways, maybe it's also setting us back. But at least in America, there is that Declaration of Independence, and even if it was once part of the Three-Fifths Compromise, now it's really there for everybody. After the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights legislation, it's on the books that everybody of citizenship, and there's a common citizenship, and that comes with that's supposed to come with rights. So there should be an ability there to, supposedly, we're supposed to be focusing on prejudice. Now, as we uncover and dig deeper in this situation in America, the systematic racism is there, or the systems that carry those inequalities from before are still present. So is the work now today is just meeting, like we said in the beginning, is just meeting people together and reducing prejudice going to change anything? I think we can easily say we could do 1,000 meetings between white and black and yellow kids, but the systems are still there. That's all barking up the wrong tree. It's all doing, not say the right work. So in Israel-Palestine, I think it's a little different, but there's still the similar dynamic here. And it roots off when we talk about there's political peace, and then there's a political peace, and there's a reconciliation. There's a work of reconciliation that, let's say tomorrow, Messiah comes, the peace plan is revealed, and the political conflict is over. We still have two societies that have 100 years of bloodshed behind them, 100 years of mistrust behind them, 100 years of a lot of bad things to say about each other, hundreds of years, even thousands of years of phrases in Judaism and Islam about each other that aren't going to disappear with that political process. And maybe then we'll catch up to America. We'll be a conflict of equals on books, but still with a world of work to do within that, on the level of what it means to really see each other as partners, to see each other as equals, to go on this next journey. And in that way, I think so to make that distinction between the civil society initiatives and the move for political change, at roots at least, we stay up till now. We've stayed focused that we're not a political movement. We're trying to build a political base to support a political movement. We're trying to build citizens who understand the needs of their neighbors and the needs of their enemies to move out of being enemies. But that's gonna have to translate into political power to move things forward. But I think there's a lot of, my Rabbi Menachem Fruman once said, what was the greatest sin of Zionism? The greatest sin of Zionism was before Judaism translated back into a political movement. The Jewish world was full of thought, of people who thought in philosophy and in Jewish thought. And people lived in these worlds, and when the world of thought and philosophy, you're always in these polemics between these different sides, and you're living that rich world of they call the study house, the Beit Midrash. He says the minute we became Zionists, everybody's walking down the street thinking like they're the prime minister, and everything gets translated into. Good, I can see people chuckling. I can't hear you, but meaning everybody, all of a sudden everybody thinks that politics is the whole thing, and when we work for things on the political level, I think we miss, and maybe that's. Once the civil rights laws were passed and the Bill of Rights and these things came about to be in American legislation and they're on the books, we think we did it. And lo and behold, we didn't. And these moments, and here I think there's a phenomenon similar to in Israel and Palestine. We thought the goal was to bring the two governments to sign a peace treaty together. And some people think that's what we need to force right now, is if we could just get the governments behind closed doors. If somebody could just force them to sign the paper, we bring back there. And for me, the analogy I always have about this is when you're swimming in the pool and you're trying to grab something. And when you make that grab, you send this ripple that pushes that thing farther and farther away. Now, who am I to, the work that was done to create the Oslo Peace Accords here, the work that was done to bring about the civil rights movement, obviously those things had to happen. They brought us forward, but at the same time, in some ways, they've also pushed some of the work we've done much more insidious, much more behind the scenes, sometimes harder to get at. And I have one more an old Hasidic tale about this. that I think is also really applicable here. And there's two Hasidic rabbis, Reb Elimelech and Reb Zusha, and they're always together and talking. And Reb Elimelech was incredibly learned and intellectual, and Reb Zusha was just always really excited. And they were studying a Kabbalistic text, and it said that in Adam and Eve, in Adam, where he was the first human, included in Adam were all the souls of all the people that ever were. And Reb Zusha says, Elimelech, that means that you and I were there. We were there. We were all, everybody on the screen were there with Adam and Eve. We were in the Garden of Eden. And then Zusha, he said, Elimelech, how could it be that you and I ate from the fruit? How could we have, you're the holiest person. How could you have done, how could we have done this? And Elimelech said to him, is because if we wouldn't have eaten from the fruit, we wouldn't have known what we had to fix. And I didn't quote it right. It's better when somebody else tells it. But meaning we had to make those. We had to go there. We had to fall. And here I think there's something where things are right now. You know, after, I mean, I think I remember my dad's on the call. I remember my dad telling me after Obama was elected in the U.S. and he said, I never could have felt the country so divided. The level of racism and divide in this country that's come out after seeing a black president. And I think, I don't know what that's going to take, eating from the fruit, but in the sense that we had to go there to expose these things, to bring them out. And if we wouldn't have gone there, they wouldn't have come out. And here, the work is before us. And the work looks much harder because the work's not just out there. It's not about signing a deal or passing it. The work is really, you know, inside all of us. So that for me is part of the calling of why the work of the personal work is still there. I agree that it's more, the political work has a much more direct path to change. And it's critical, obviously, in Israel and Palestine and in the US, that things are being translated to that level. It's being, the work on the ground of the civil society, of the multicultural programming, diversity programming, are being translated into those policies. And I think that's definitely, especially from the moments of protest, to see how do we move out there. When these things come up, how do we find a way to make the vessels to carry them forward? At the same time, I think that work between communities within, on the grassroots is also going to be critical. And here's another part that I realize that I don't want to realize, because I'm also of the fast food generation. I want to believe that we can make peace. I want to believe that we'll reach the promised land. I want to believe that we can get there. But one of the things that I think we have to is there's parts of this work and these issues that are so deeply a part of being human, a part of where we are right now, that we have to think about the generational aspects of where things are going. And we have to, and it's hard to say this in a time when injustice and pain and suffering is there. We can't not face the call. But at the same time, I think there is some levels of this work that we have to be able to take chart the long course. And sometimes we want to be there. We want to take down every what if we took down all the statues of all the racists? There'd be very few people. I think we've all agreed that there's racism in everybody. There's going to be nobody left. But part of the fear of this is that we need to see what we've done. We need to see those broken parts, those things that are not fixed. And maybe we don't need to see them. Maybe we're ready. And this is as speaking as a white person in the conversation in America. Maybe I need to see it. Maybe I don't. If I was black, maybe I wouldn't say the same thing. We don't need to see it. We're seeing it enough. But I feel there's some level of here being able to make that distinction between the things that are going to take a long time and they're not going to be fixed in this generation. In some ways, by trying to push that forward, we're pushing people away. I feel that here. I think sometimes there's so much and maybe I'll try to close with, at least kind of conclude my section of just speaking a lot into a screen. Activism, this trying to make change in the Bible, in the Old in the Torah. The mitzvah that it most resonates me. What is change about on a biblical level? What's the commandment to fix society? The phrase "tikkun olam," fixing the world, doesn't show up in the Old Testament. But we do have a commandment amongst the Jewish people to each other, that when you see your neighbor doing something that's not right, to rebuke. Now, rebuke is a hard translation, lehochiach, to prove, to reprove, because out of a sense of we're ultimately we're all in this together. If somebody over there is not behaving right, we as the Jewish people are saying we're all being judged together. On a spiritual level, on many different levels, we're all bound together in something. And I have an obligation to my brother, my sister, for myself, and for them, to help them. Now it's a very powerful commandment. You can imagine how many things were said in the name of rebuking. And in fact, 2,000 years ago, Rabbi Akiva said, in my generation, 2,000 years ago, there's nobody around that can really give rebuke anymore. Because the way people do it is so, sullied, it's so unpure. Maybe it's so full of pride, maybe it's so full of derision, it's so bound up with things, but when they try to rebuke somebody, it doesn't work. And the test of rebuke is, do people hear it? And the test of activism on the planning level, not on the level of a protest when you have to scream, but can somebody hear it? Is it being heard? And that puts us in a big dilemma, especially faced with the pain and injustice and things that need to change, in the sense that there are people doing things that are absolutely wrong. But how do I fulfill my commandment, my call to seek a better world, to fix things, to be aware of what's going on and work for the change? At the same time, I have this other voice there saying that if the rebuke's not heard, it's sometimes doing worse, and that's a huge challenge in activism. I have the tendency to be very cautious about that one, and that maybe sometimes that leaves me not protesting enough. I think there's also a place here, in a sense, for people, different roles within a movement, for people to do different things. Hanan and I have talked about this a lot. How do we make fixings? Do we need to stand on the mountain and proclaim? And I absolutely, there's moments, Roots does not run a lot of protests. There's been a few moments when we felt the need to call and to go out into the street and say, this is wrong and we need to make a noise about this. But in general, our work is much more about trying to work as much as we can within the societies, within the schools, within the places that don't want you to come be rabble rousers and do this, but to make that approach. Sometimes we've been too silent. Sometimes there's moments we haven't spoken up, and maybe we should. And I think both Israelis and the Palestinians have felt that from each other, that we need you to stand up here. We need to hear your voice. If we called out here, you call out there. And that's also been a process of building partnership and alliance here, about how to build an alliance across conflict and find a way to move forward, about really spending the time listening to to really bring these two sides together and look eye to eye. And at least then, if I can't speak out, my partner understands why I can't speak out. And I think we've come to that kind of moment within the kind of the core Roots leadership, I think, several times along initiatives of, we need you to say something, but I understand why you can't say that. And for the good of the future of our work, we're gonna be silent here. And in that moment, I think, at least in Roots, at least it comes down to the trust among the people there that it's for the sake of the work of the process that we're being silent, not because of our own callousness or lack of seeing what's wrong. That's a lot of words. I'm happy to, if people have questions, or I think I'm going to a little more discussion format, and Hanan is here, but anybody's welcome to either to post it, to post in the chat, or if people want to unmute and
Hi, this is Morris Freed. I think one issue is that there's something that seems to be implied in Torah, and I believe explicitly stated in Talmud, that never was. And that's that if we sin, we will be expelled from the land, but then the land will be desolate and uninhabited, and God would never allow any other people to settle there. And that never happened. For whatever reason, Hashem allowed people to settle over all these centuries and millennia. And that does give them some rights to the land, being allowed to go in there and stay.
I mean, I think it's, there's kind of a side, isn't it? But in the Muslim world are the children of Abraham. And the land I'm going to give to Abraham and your children. I mean, there's a very strong textual basis for, in a sense, what we're all doing here. In a sense, maybe that's an opening. If I talk about it, one of the differences in the conflict here in Israel-Palestine to the States is a question of citizenship. In the United States, people are all citizens of one country. It's a question of rights and equality within that space. Here, like I said, that's not the place. Can we create a sense of acknowledged belonging as children of Abraham here? It's a lot of work, and both within the Jewish story and within the Muslim story, we have many reasons why those Jews or those Muslims, those Palestinians, those Israelis have no rights here. And that's definitely, I think, a part of Ruth's work is, and the general work for peace is trying to find that framework that sees going a step beyond, of course, what you're saying, and not just that allowed, but there's a divine providence. And I think it's not an accident for Muslims that the Zionists ended up coming back. It's not an accident for religious Israelis that the Palestinians just showed up. That kind of, those aren't accidents. And I think that's a different conversation, a need for maybe a positive religious voice if approaching religious communities about what we're doing.
I have a question for you, Shaul.
Yeah. Colleen?
Yeah, Colleen.
Hi.
Hi there.
Hi.
I first of all just want to say how refreshing it is to hear the grassroots voice, and please never feel it's less intelligent than those who profess to know. It's I've heard from many different people, and yours is the freshest. I'm wondering if you could articulate in what you see happening there. What is the core of what Roots open space for to happen? What, in its most intimate core sense, happens that's not even about land or citizenship or the technical term of rights? It comes out from the deepest place. What do you think it is? And it might be the core of fear, it might be the core of hope, or in between. What do you allow to open in the space you work on creating there?
Wow, great question. And I imagine, I know for different people in there's many different things going on. One is to the other. We both sides live in this conflict with a deep sense of other. And I think some of the most intimate aspects of the other that have been shared at Roots is the pain. For Israelis to see Palestinian pain, if it's on the sense of loss of old things, or if it's things that happened yesterday, and vice versa. And the connection between our pain and our identities here in the conflict, in a sense of, in many ways, are very deep. That's one very real side that comes up. the space that it's open, the core of what the space for is partnership, is this, to a sense to find that those people in that village over there, Israeli, not my village, are my partners. That they recognize me, they don't want to throw me out this land, and it really that's largely the sense that most of our communities walk with. The other side had their way, we'd be out, and those people see me, they respect, and there's a sense of we're working towards a common vision here. That I think that space of partnership, that, wow, okay. Speaking as Israeli, those Palestinians, my partners really see violent resistance and violence as wrong, and not just that, they really actually acknowledge us Israelis as Jewish people who came back. Which is the most simplest statement on the Israeli side of what we're doing here, but it's absolutely not on the Palestinian side. Vice versa, for Palestinians, I think, to see the national recognition and to see the pain of what's being caused by our presence here, and a sense that there's a voice in that town who's going to advocate for me, who's going to walk with me in solidarity, who's trying to change this. I think so those levels of solidarity and recognition, going both ways, I think are. I do want to say that I think Roots is doing that and doing that work in order to extract or protract from those individual experiences to something bigger. Our understandings of what we talk about the need to generate a new discourse around the conflict is being extracted from those personal experiences and conversations that have gone there, to maybe what both sides need or to feel to re-engage in a political process. So I think it goes back from that personal back to that bigger, but like you asked them on the personal side, I think it's those sides. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm looking through going through. Okay, I'm going back to the chat. If people want to share questions verbally also, that's great. I'm going to go back there.
Hi, Shaul. Can I ask a question?
Hi, Andrew. Hi, yeah.
Hey. So first, I really appreciate the presentation. It's really interesting, and yeah, a lot to think about in what you shared. So in terms of like what's going on here, I think that for a long time, that a part of the reason that so for me, I'm white, obviously, and I'm also a Christian. And so I think that, unfortunately, the segment of the white population that is most resistant to racial reconciliation and towards like an honest accounting of our past are other Christians. So like white Christians like me. And I think a part of what's going on, I mean, there's other reasons too, but a part of what's going on is that many of us really want to be proud of our history, proud of our country's history, proud of the actions of people who are like us. So meaning, proud of what white Christians have done throughout our history. And so it's really hard for us to acknowledge, what white people have done to African Americans throughout the history and what they've done to Native Americans as well. And so when we hear, an honest accounting of the racial issues in our history and how that affects what's going on today and the pain that it's caused African Americans, Native Americans, we perceive it or feel it as a threat to our identity because we can't feel proud of our heritage as we want to. And I'm wondering if there's anything like that going on in the situation of Israel-Palestine, and however that relates to what you're doing here, if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I think that's great. I'm trying to translate it into Israel-Palestine. It's very different, but it's very similar. I also think that
Sure.
I think we have a sense that we walk with a general sense that our people will have done the right thing. And there's maybe been some aberrations, some bad people, but to say that our people have been trying to do the right thing in the Israeli cause, in the Palestinian cause, in the white cause, in the black cause, I think we have that hope. And when you're faced with the rebuke what happens? And you're called out, called out of this whole thing that I believe in that really is, and this is, I think you're very right about the problem. It's not, when you're calling out those people, those slave owners back then, those are my people, because I'm the white Christian like them. When you're calling out the Jews, the Zionists did this, that's my people. You're pointing at me. When you're calling the Palestinians murdered children, you're calling out me. And a lot of that is what keeps us divided, that level of pushes us away from engaging, just in a sense, because it becomes, like I said, the personal is political. And when you make those political charges for people who live in those identities and identify and hold those identities dear, it becomes, that I think that's part of why we're left with these collective groups that are in conflict with each other. In a previous conversation, I think a lot of what we're doing in those confrontations is talking about how bad, how much evil there was. And I'll speak in Israel-Palestine. Many groups are advocating for Palestinian rights, and the theory of change is if we just show the Israelis how bad it is, how ugly it is, they'll stop. Many Israelis feel if we just point out how barbaric the Palestinians were in their attacks on civilians, that'll somehow make us prove that we're right and they're wrong. And I know for myself, my response to those voices, that it shuts me down entirely. I think part of the power of the work of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s was by taking Christianity and holding those values and calling us to be better people, as better Americans. And and I think that again goes to part of one of the advantages, and maybe you totally correct me if I'm off this, but the basic Christianity of America is a place of bonding between a lot of the Black community and the white community. Is there a much deeper role there for religious figures to come up and be those voices? Can it be a space for calling upon those kind of and addressing within them, obviously, the biblical ammunition for racism that's there, which there's plenty of too. But I think there's a deep power for that work, and I say here in Israel-Palestine, I definitely at Roots' work, it's that Judaism can be better than this. That as religious Jews who believe in our connection to the land, and that's a bit what gains Roots its niche in the peace world. Nobody else is speaking to religious settlers and saying, you should be part of the peace camp. You can do better. People are saying you're the cause of the conflict. You're the evil. Nobody's talking to religious Muslims, to Hamas, and saying you have the heritage of Islam behind you. You have so much to give of what it means to bring humility before God, to bring the legacy of Ibrahim, everything, to bring those things forward. Can you make that flip? Can we, and in a sense, turn those identities and empower those identities to be the vessels to move things forward? I think if we don't, we're lost, because those are the powerful voices in those societies. Those are the voices that really know who they are and carry themselves forward. If we don't address those kind of roots of identity and how we move forward, we end up with the liberal humanist camp of people who don't identify so much with this and don't know so much with this, and it becomes a very self-selecting audience. So I think on the grassroots level, for sure, there's a need to do that, to go to those places, and to try to engage those identities. From what I see in America, I think you're definitely right. It's a sense of this was in a white Christian country, and it's no longer, or it's becoming no longer, and that's provoking a huge sense of fear. And like I said, there's a generation of work there. There's multiple generations of work there. And then the question, I guess, in America, in the same way in Israel-Palestine, the same way in America, is it about transcending those strong cultural, ethnic, national identities and moving to some new promised land identity of we're all Americans? In Israel-Palestine, is it about leaving these, being a little less Israeli, being a little less Palestinian, and moving forward into some kind of new kind of identity? Maybe, but those things will take a long. I also generally feel, my observation around the world, we had a good half century of trying to combat nationalism and move into a more humanistic, universalistic perspective of identity. And one of the things it did was set off massive backlash amongst every ethnic identity, out of a sense of being, and it's the same on white power and black power and Serbian power and all these. And we can try to say we need to just get over it again, but I think not. I think the rainbow will need to be comprised of those different colors, which means it's doubly harder work. But I think that's kind of the longer term work that we need to aim for too.
Yeah, a lot to think about. Thank you.
That was a very partial answer. So. I'm going, come on, tell me what do I do? Do I read comments? Do I have to pull questions from the comments, right? Within Israel, the Muslim of Palestinian descent in theory are equals as citizens. No. If so, that is much like what happens in the US. Still systemic racism. Also, when I understand what equal and favors, right? I mean, the question that Robin wrote about there, absolutely, the questions of racism and discrimination here are present. I think in the last few years there's been a lot more attention putting on these issues. I'd say these things are moving in some ways. I think I'd also make a distinction between the kind of the racism in Israeli, all the different prejudices across within Israeli society, and then Palestinian Israeli citizens, the Arab Israelis. It adds a whole different level, because then it's part of this also. It's part of this ethno-national conflict, and the fear level there is definitely a part of the. And that's for me. That's always been in the sense of the compare and contrast between racism in America and what expressed itself as racism here with Israeli-Palestinian racism. What do you mean? We're at war. Racism is something you have when you're part of a shared society and people don't acknowledge it because of difference. Here, there's a national conflict that's going on, and it's so to project from one to the other is very. I think the analogies do fall short there. I think we miss the work that needs to be done in Israel-Palestine if we think about it just in terms of racial justice in the States, and if we try to extrapolate about racial justice in the States from what's going on here, I think we're also. I think like I go back to the beginning, like activism needs to be very grounded in the place where it takes place, in the cultural context, in the national context. Feel free to speak up in other questions. I'm also kind of.
Oh, hi there, Shaul.
Hi.
Hi. Sorry, I hope I can be heard.
Yeah, Meira. Okay. Yes.
Oh, thank you. Firstly, I just want to say your words are. Forgive me for my lack of coherence right now, but this is overwhelming in many ways, but in many transforming ways, and I respect so deeply your manner of presenting this material, being as clear and open and transparent as you've been. And with that, I hold on one second. The challenge that I have is not a challenge, but I'm at a very unique intersection of being a Jewish woman of color, and that being a very major part of my personal family narrative, history, ancestry, and everything that you've discussed regarding what's going on here in the States on our soil. Equally, the work that you're doing in the communities. And I guess what I'm seeing right now is I'm having a difficult time. Hold on, sorry. And maybe you might have to come back to me, but I've had many conversations, difficult conversations within the Jewish community, and those who have that sentiment of, okay, what's going on right now in the States, you know, I'm having difficulty expressing sympathy or regard or empathy, just considering the Jewish story, considering that You know, we've been through it and back again. And over the millennia, as you so aptly described in the beginning, and I can very much understand and see that through that lens. But what my point that I'm looking to make is that within the Black community, and when you talk about specific identities and holding on so tightly to those, there's been such a fracture where there hasn't been a continuity of tradition of be it spiritual or of cultural, because that was just obliterated in many ways. And I know Andrew spoke to that as being, you know, as a Caucasian Christian, and that unease, and that's felt so heavily for our country's history. So I guess my question to you is, how does that play out in the encounters that you've had with your Palestinian counterparts, who feel as if their history, their storyline, their narratives are just being kind of imploding by virtue of what's going on? And again, please excuse my lack of clarity right now, because I'm trying to piece this as clearly as I can. And I don't know if what I'm asking or communicating is coming across.
If one thing I think I heard that I'll clarify, the African American experience has a complete break with past through slavery, right? And the loss of that heritage. And,
yes.
And then here you asked about in Palestinian society, and in Palestinian society, are they dealing with the same break?
Not necessarily the same break. I mean, it goes on in both realms, but I guess in terms of that sense of not being heard,
Mm-hmm.
To what extent? Because as you said, you know, when you hear your counterparts speak of, well, if just the other side would know to what extent that they have caused such harm and tragedy, then, you know, they would just rise up. So I don't know if, maybe I will come back and try to revisit what exactly I'm wishing to ask.
I mean, I mean, one is obviously, I should Khalid or no, a Palestinian counterpart should really answer that question in a sense. But one thing, there's a lot of strength in Palestinian society. There's a lot of the connection and you know, connection in culture and society here is very strong. And in that way, the power dynamics on many ways are skewed the other way. But I'll speak here in West Bank and Judea, you know, in this area here. The families are standing in their tradition. A lot of families are standing here in their land with their traditions. It'd be very different if we're talking about refugee communities. And there is some of that within the refugee camps here. But already they've been. But I want to. But that's something which was very powerful in this conflict is how connected both sides are to their past and walking with a lot of strength from them. And I think if you ask a lot of Palestinians if they think if Israel will exist in 50 years, they'll say no. Meaning there's even with, what do you mean? Israel has nuclear weapons, but there's a strong sense of that power of a truth on our side and a power on our side, even if things are horrible and painful. And I think that's part of what Palestinian strength to endure the pain comes from places like that.
Thank you.
But feel free to rephrase it. Feel free to.
Sure. And one thing I will say very quickly is that I feel that our identities, as tightly as we hold on to them, when that fear comes, it comes because we see how inherently fragile they are. And that's where things just kind of derail. And there's an unwillingness to come to terms with that. And I will tell you, you know, my vision for the African American community as well is to rise up into another level and place of identity and, yes, self-determination, but in a context where, you know, we're seeing that what we've held on to so tightly requires, you know, just another infusion of lifting up. And the things that have enabled us to get to this point have been precious and vital, and we need to honor that, but and at the same time recognize that it's not going to come from anywhere else. And it's, you know, imperative that we, you know, rise to in this moment. So
I hear similar voices from like my most inspiring Palestinian counterparts, and I also feel deeply in Judaism that's the same process. I mean, and the way you phrase it. These conflicts force us to clench tight and hold on to these things because they're under threat in these conflicts. We're being attacked because we're Black, because we're part of this Jewish community, from this Palestinian community. At the same time, what's really needed is to be able to be those things in this bigger way. And that's really the conundrum. I think you really made it well. Like, that's the conundrum about this struggle, is we're really being called to be much bigger than we are and to go to a new place, into a sense of level of evolution. And what conflict does is force us the opposite direction of constricting and holding on and combating and not being able to grow. So that's, you know, I think that's also a big part why within Israeli society, what I feel a big level of that part of things is happening in Judaism in Israel. But in the conflict zone is a place where it shuts down. And I think there's tremendous things evolving in what it means to be Jewish, and all these kinds of big inner Jewish conversation happening in some beautiful, expressive, colorful ways that haven't been, and it's happening. And then the conflict is a place where it all kinds of shuts down because there's a survival, there's a fight or flight mode. It's a traumatic place.
yes.
I think also same thing in Palestinians. I think I agree that the struggles for Palestinian society to do that are much more impinged because of the conflict, because of the power dynamics. And in that way, I think a deep part of the work going on here is, in addition to the joint spaces, is this within these cadres within the Palestinian leadership and this Jewish leadership, in those spaces that are us talking about us and who we are, and who we want to be and who we really are, and and stepping out of the victim, that victim places, which was in the conflicts, we all see ourselves as victims. And the white nationalists see themselves as victims there, and that's why they're fighting back. And that space is it brings out the smallest in us. It really does.
Beautiful. No, it's beautifully said. And I just will say this: I recognize heavily, the scope of trauma, and the thing is that I feel too that one thing that is lacking is that there has not been that chain of tradition that's afforded, my Israeli community the ability to endure, to rise up wherever they are in any part of the globe. So that's something that I see as enduring and very precious, and I'm just looking at ways to how to in some ways supplement or create that in what I'm seeing here on the ground in the States.
Yeah. I agree. That's I think that's one of the most painful parts of the African American experience, is that break with tradition is and then
Thank you very much. So I respect and appreciate you so greatly. So please.
Anyone else can unmute themselves and ask or engage Shaul.
I had a question that I put in the chat, but
yeah.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if Israelis or Palestinians hear about your group and they want to participate, are there social and or political repercussions that come as a result of their participation?
Yeah,
and how do you handle those?
Yeah. Actually, here it also breaks down very different on the Israeli and Palestinian side. On the Palestinian side, there can be very, according to the Oslo Accords, which Israel and Palestine signed on to, Israelis living over the Green Line are settlers. And according to that discourse, the Palestinian Authority didn't recognize these communities as legitimate. So, and one of the ways the conflict is played out, and through the frustration of the diplomatic process, is one of the things, is really a policy of not normalizing with those parts of the conflict that Palestinians see as wrong. So yeah, it's for Palestinian participation. It's at a risk. And obviously one of the first premises of partnership is trust, and that means it's on the Israeli side. People, my neighbors might disagree. You know, I'll also say on the Israeli side, it's not everybody's. And is this This is on the Israeli side. It's more on a tactical level about keeping a lower profile or not. But a lot of things in Israel, on the Israeli side, we'd want to publicize and go public, but that would be jeopardizing our partnerships. You know, that'd be in the kind of recognizing the what I call the asymmetries in where societies are, where the conflict is needing to respect that. It's definitely been one of the learning curves and understanding as an organization. So what is our role there in understanding that? At the same time, I think we've tried to play it smart. And one is a lot of just being we're very much off the media. We don't do a lot of things publicly. We're very careful with, if you look on our website, there's a very few Palestinian faces that can comfortably be there. And part of the work here is trying to create a new discourse that can allow that. But that's easy to say, much harder done. And with the lack of any real political peace process on the Palestinian side, any participation in these peace programs, I mean, all across the board, not just roots with the settlers, but the participation in peace program is, why are you still going to these dialogue groups when, Israel has just talked about unilaterally taking 30% of the land? What's this doing? So that, there's a big need for a reassessment. So my friend Khalid would say, part of the problem is we've been using this Oslo, we've been stuck in this Oslo paradigm. And it's not the people that are wrong, it's the plan that's wrong. But the whole world's still holding this. We need to think of a new model. And in that model, maybe doesn't mean, and that can allow a re-engagement with these things. But until that happens, you're right. As the first, so yeah, there's definitely that social criticism. It's easy for somebody to make a stink for somebody else by pointing out that they're going to they're normalizing with the enemy. And that's a weapon you can use in Palestinian society to critique somebody you don't like. At the same time, I think that's why it's also going back to there's the personal transformation work, and then there's keeping this eye, and I think that's something the Palestinians have kept us honest with, is that we can't just be talking about personal transformation here. We need to be talking about these core questions of equality and working to move towards a political reality that's going to bring equality and rights to both sides. Even if we don't sign on what exactly that looks like, but that's where we need to go. So for some people, that's enough. And I think if we find more and more Palestinians actually looking at what we're doing and saying, wait a second, you're talking about that new direction forward. What does that look like? And can we go there? That's but that's, yeah, your question is definitely true. It's not on the Israeli side. I think it also goes. It's also on both sides. It's very emotional. People's openness, to, in a year where there's a lot of violence and a lot of bloodshed in our region, definitely the people's reactions to it are much different. The sense of betraying something, or just kind of touching open wounds. But there's not the political censoring of that's something that's crossing a national red line. I think on level that they're going to face repercussions from the government from.
Yeah. I was reading in the forward, I think, that that there is. I know that there are various organizations that bring Jews and Arabs together within Israel, and one of them that I saw recently was an orchestra between the youth Palestinian and Israeli children, and I'm just wondering if Roots can somehow do things together with those organizations or schools and so forth. You talked about. There was one that we visited in 2017. I think when we came to see you, we visited the orchard of Abraham's children, and I'm wondering if there's if somehow Roots can participate with some of these organizations that bring people together to show that there are ways of making a shared and mutually respectful society of all of the land's inhabitants.
So Roots, we do work with several other organizations that, we do a fair amount of partnerships with other groups. If it's hosting them for conversation with us or traveling to speak with them. Our young adult program also kind of meets some of these other groups. But I would say there's also a need to distinguish. I think the orchestra, for instance, is the technical definition people are using now is there's shared society initiatives, which are projects within Israel, happening within the Green Line of Israel for Israelis and Palestinians, for Arabs and Jews within the Green Line, citizens. And I think the orchestra, pretty sure the orchestra project works like that. The YMCA in Jerusalem has also as a joint choir. And people term that shared society. Roots' work falls into the category of what's called cross-border. And even though we don't know what the border is, but in a sense, it's things that are existing in this process. We're not in the same political boat. It's not clear if we're going to be in a two-state solution in one state, if we're going to end up as citizens of the same country or as citizens of different countries. The settlements will stay, the settlements will go. And doing work with that, with bringing Palestinians from the West Bank and Israelis, or with Roots, with both of us living out here, the ability to do the kind of personal work, or the people-to-people work is much harder, because there's those core questions of the conflict that come up more. I think on both sides. I think when you're living in the Galil, there's very little Arab-Jewish violence that's going on in the Galil. But people recognize we're living here together, and it's better if our kids know each other and work on prejudice and the opportunities that we can create together, and regional planning, all those things you can kind of really go for. In my town, there's families coming back with rocks and every now and worse going through their windows. In the Palestinian town, there's Israeli soldiers going to arrest the rock throwers, so here the ability to embark on those kinds of people is much, much more challenging. And that also needs, in a sense, to put a little bit more, in a sense, bite or a little more political edge into what we're doing. At least until some kind of new political framework allows, that sense of equality, I think, and before the law, before the political arrangements.
Another question, another issue? Feel free. Gilda.
I've been sitting here and fighting with myself whether to participate in this conversation or not, because my mentally, I am with everybody, with everything that Roots stands for. Obviously, I am committed enough to show up every week. But emotionally, I have a fear that I can't let go of. So the fear has to do with, I won't dwell too much on my history other than to say, I am a product of the Holocaust, not because I lived through it, but because my family lived through it and I was fed that in my mother's milk. So Judaism is one of the biggest value I have. It governs my life. I fear, this is the fear, I fear that if we live as equals in one country, I fear that we will be outnumbered and we will lose control of our destiny. And that thought is just frightening to me, because past is prologue. We've had anti-Semitism before. We have anti-Semitism now, probably more than we even understand. So it's there. It sits over our heads like a black cloud all the time, everywhere we go. We don't procreate as much as Arab people do. I say that with regret, but it's a reality. It's a reality we have to deal with. And if we become a minority, then we lose a home, we lose a safe haven, we lose, fill in the blank. We lose everything. So how do you address that? I'm hoping maybe you'll say something that will make my fear go away.
Well, um, survival. I mean, I think the Jewish people.
Survival, absolutely. That's the word. You bet.
Yeah, yeah. That's. I mean, for many of us, we've pinned our hopes on Israel as a vessel to bring it to, so we survive.
Yes.
I think Jews in America have pinned their hopes on liberal values that will survive as a minority, but as a people, you know, and now the question of survival is a little bit different than the question of flourishing, right?
Okay.
Yeah. And I think you're right. From our past, the drive to survive is what we came out with. It. There's no doubt. I mean, that's the basic minimum. To even suggest a life of plenty to somebody who knows hunger when they're looking for a piece of food, and to just forget a life of plenty. So that's, you know, in that process of where we'll go, you know, and where we are right now. You know, in your generation and our generation, these generations are so close to that pain. It's clear that trauma is still a guiding factor to where. And I want to go back to Andrew's question about these national identities, and that for me is true. That's why the one-state solution is not a good solution. It's not a good solution for the Jewish people. Not necessarily a good solution for the Palestinian people either. I think our peoples are different, but being that the Jewish people are one part of the equation here in this land, it's going to need to be so. But so that's why I think we need a national home. I'm a Zionist. Okay, I believe in that state as that vessel. But I think because of that, we have to we can't stop there. And the survival of our people is not to survive so we survive. Our people have a quest to do something good in the world. You know, we're not just staying around to stay around. And part of that quest is to be a part of a better world. And part of that is to come back to our land and face the challenges of what it means to be here. And I'd say here we can't talk about our survival without the Palestinian people's survival and flourishing, because we're tied together in this land. So my survivalism, in a sense, it can't remain in a bunker. Even if it has to be in a bunker, I have to keep that other hand seeking, you know, to keep seeking that hand to move out of the bunker. And ultimately, it's going to be the Palestinian hand that's going to pull us out of the bunker, we pray, and vice versa. And we're going to have to pull them out of the bunker we've created for ourselves and each other. You know, for me, what does that look like? That means somehow we need, and I think somebody wrote in the comments about, Karen wrote, this equal access to the entire land, equal dignity, equal law. So when we see that, I don't know if that's what triggered your question in a sense of what maybe made the fear come up. Are you talking about equal access, equal the entire land? Is that one state?
Yes.
Here, I think we need to be creative, and I think there are other people smarter than me in politics that are looking for new political designs that can ensure both people have a national home, but can also acknowledge that integrity of the land and both people's connection to that land. You know, I think we had a few weeks ago, it was 2 states, 1 homeland is one example of a Confederate model, you know, of how to move forward in this conflict in this land. Next week, I know Emmanuel, who's on the call here, is talking about a federal model, which both ways are there, trying to find a way that on the one hand respects the national story and stays true to that. Either I think for those people on the call who feel that in their kishkas, feel that in their gut, that need for that, that's one thing. For people who don't feel that feeling themselves, but to recognize that's a core feeling of what the Jewish people carry. And if we want to talk about a future in this conflict, we need to be real with the peoples in this conflict, and vice versa to Palestinian needs. So that's a part of coming to, I think, to recognize that what you're saying, those fears about survival need to, we can talk about the vision of a joint land for all, but we're a long way from that right now. We're not so far away from people cutting each other's throats and and all this violence. So we need to be able to make those, and part of the weakness of the peace camp, I think sometimes, well, it's not accurate. Much of the left in Israel of the peace camp bases their 2-state solution on security. And this is what's going to keep us secure. but that's security for, definitely when you talk about what do Palestinians want rights, and Israel wants security. That's on the core societal level. Palestinians want freedom, rights, and Israelis want security.
We lost you.
Shaul, we lost you.
I think he's muted.
Yeah, I
Could
can't.
you unmute him? Could you unmute him?
I can't. It's stuck.
Uh-oh.
Can you talk now? No, we don't hear you. Something in his computer. He'll try for a few minutes to fix it.
It's so hard, I guess, especially after the Holocaust, but what we were taught from the beginning is our security is not in politics or demographics or anything other than trusting in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed is He. That has to be, even after the Holocaust, the sole basis for our security. I mean, my experience is very different from Gilda's. I grew up Jewish, but I think I was in my late teenage years when the paperback edition of Shira's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich came out, and I picked it up and I read it that I first even learned about the Holocaust. Wow. Nobody in my family ever talked it. So I didn't internalize it the way Gilda and others did. But still somehow, even past that, our security has to be in the Holy One.
I don't know if Shaul can hear us.
I can hear now. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah.
Did you hear what
Boris was saying?
Morris Fried said?
About just the primacy of security.
Well, Morris was saying that historically, traditionally, Jews didn't depend on their physical power. Mm-hmm. They depended on something else.
Yeah. This was designed, I'll say, I was talking about, this was in a sense the Zionist revolution. To say we're not going to be at the behests of other people's kindness and just holding on our spiritual merits. We're gonna do something in the world, in the physical world, and go out and make a change. It's very radical theology for a religious Jew, secular theology, and I think out of a sense of survival, out of a sense of a call for survival. And I think one of the challenges right now is and this is something Rav Kook writes about this tremendously and over and over and over again, about there's something holy in protecting yourself and surviving, physically surviving, but that's like your body. You have a soul, and if the soul and that part of yourself doesn't affect who you are, then that's not a very holy body, and they need to bring those things together. And there is a command. It's clear there's a commandment to save your life and to do what you need to do to save your life. There's a commandment: if somebody's coming to kill you, you're allowed to kill them. That's a part of physical being in this world, and it even has a moral side to it. But there's also a calling to go much deeper than that. And my friend Ali often says that in Palestinian identity, there's a confusion or an unclarity of are we revolutionaries, liberation fighters, or building a state and citizens. And I think also, which is and I think on the Israeli side, there's a question: are we still in the mode of survival? And in survival, almost anything goes to help yourself survive. Or can we step out of that and move into the world of applying higher morals and higher aspirations than just survival? When the conflict rages, we go back to being survivalists and liberation fighters. When it calms down, do we seize enough the opportunity to go beyond that to build those bridges. And I think in both those identities, it's hard. You know, it's hard to find the space to pull out. And going back to what Mira said, you know, when you're in the struggle of, you're feeling the oppression, you're feeling the prejudice, feeling everything against you, you just want to struggle and fight. And where do you come the space to go and become that, to think from that higher self? I think that's definitely on the internal struggles of going on here. Like Boris said, there's a challenge there to reclaim that spiritual aspect of the spiritual, the moral calling, and be able to apply it. And yeah, Lenka, hi.
That might be a good place to end, but I'll also ask Shaul if you'd like to say any words in closing.
No, we said many words. I'm okay. But I just say that going back to this place within civil society, that it's no doubt it's an incredibly challenging time around the world in every which way, and add to the levels of COVID and global pandemic, and then add to that all the other levels of recognizing of how much work there's ahead in all these struggles. And I will say the one thing that keeps us going is definitely the partnership. It's the partnership. It's of that here in Roots, there's Israelis who feel Palestinians with them, and Palestinians who feel Israelis with us in this. And I kind of always had this vision of a global. There's this global civil society at work, each place in its home and its own causes and its own places. But it's I guess it's an honor to be a part of that process. In all of its challenges and futility sometimes. And just close with a blessing for all of us to feel empowered, to make the small changes, to not put them down, and to challenge ourselves, to constantly challenge ourselves to think bigger also, and to learn to be better partners to all the struggles we're working for. And thank you. It's been a treat.
Thank you, Shaul.
If anybody wants to follow up, I know me. If anybody, I'm happy if people want to have thoughts or want to reflect something afterwards. I'll put my email up here, and I'm happy to continue conversation in any way. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaul.
Thank you, Shaul.
Very deep stuff.
Thank you.
Important issues. Let's just remind everyone that next week at the same time, we're talking about federation models for a future solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We'll have
Right.
Emmanuel Shachaf, who's the founder of one of a number of federation advocacy organizations. Emmanuel Shachaf will be talking together with a roots activist with the name of Gidon Elazar, who's also written about the models of federation. We'll be talking about it both from a theoretical perspective and from a practical perspective. So please tune in next week as well. Good day and good night, everyone.
Shalom.
Excellent. Thanks a lot.
Bye. Bye, Jules. Bye.
Great to see you.
Shaul
Bye.
Judelman, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Shaul. Thank you.
You go that. Thank you.
And Rob Schlesinger. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Andrew.
Bye. It's good to see you.
Good day too. Ciao. Lay down.
Anand, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Dad, how are you?
Okay, good to see you again.
So
Yeah.
you were, this was the second or third time, the fourth time you were on the same call with Shaul's parents.
Oh, yes, yes, I remember that. Now,
Very
you know,
good.
keep trying, don't give up.
Yeah.
Bye now.
Bye. Meredith, did you want to stay and talk to Shaul or?
Oh, thank you. I was trying to reply via chat and just, I Thank you so heavily. My apologies for my lack of clarity. I think because my head was spinning, I wasn't able to just, very completely just get it out. So thank you for your time with that. And I think once I just kind of step back and revisit, I'll be able to even maybe in writing share. But the thing I know so heavily is that Torah has saved us, through everything, and I ache so deeply when I consider how that same treasure of tradition in some form has not quite been, available or had the same continuity for the African American community, because I know how heavily and deeply I have, adored having that equally as a part of my being.
You just from when I was in college in Southern California, and in there we doing work around police brutality, and then I came to Israel at the end of college, and then in Israel I was completely surprised. I had no idea what was waiting for me in Judaism, and turned on, and I went back for graduation, and there was a black student named Quincy who was really involved. Also, the police I knew pretty not well, but we worked a lot on the police brutality stuff. And I went back and we were talking, and I said, I've been in Israel. And I told him I'm going back, and I had this question of what's there. Also it was right at the beginning. It was the second Intifada. It was a very hectic, crazy time here. But I remember feeling this sense of what I'd found here, of tradition, and my tradition, and our people's tradition, and this wealth. And Quincy was somebody who was very involved with Black Power and taking, and seeking, and going back to African roots. And we had a lot of conversation about these things. But it was so. I felt like I had $1 million in my pocket, like $1 billion in my pocket, and it wasn't there for him, and he didn't, and it was grasping for these things to hold on to but they had been cut off, and nobody knows where his family was from, and that it was so painful. Oh. It was. I felt like the richest. I felt like the rich kid. I just and that really stuck with me, and also. And it was interesting. A month later, I was working on a friend's farm, and I ran into a Native American kid who was working on the land on their farm, and his tribe had lived there, his uncle. They stayed in the area, and speaking to him was such a he got it. You're going to Israel. You're going back to your people's land. Of course, it was so simple, and his uncle, one of the people who most knows the land and the traditions and speaks, kept the language, is a carrier of their tradition. And it's that wealth of what it is, a tradition and to carry you in your people's struggles through today. And that way, Palestinian society is very well set, at least here, I imagine some of the refugee communities and diaspora communities, it changes. But it was, you're right, in the sense of what holds our people together, what gives our people the strength, what gives us the inspiration. I think, for looking to hear Myron and Hanan on the call here, this inspiration about this work, about engaging with it's such a wealth, a basis to work in, and it's really not to be taken for granted in that way.
Shaul, thank you. I just have to say, you speak with such a awareness that is not often identified in so many other spaces and circles. So I think that's a gift for us. So I thank you and Rav Hanan so deeply. And I just, it's hard to see the internal division that shows itself, because the desire is there within the African community. It's huge, it's there, and you have powerful, movements and acts of solidarity, and yet there is, it's so often, you know, there's this moment where things just, for many reasons, I can't even begin to enter that, you know, but where things just become not unhinged, but because the intellect, the clarity is there, you know, the energy is there. But, you know, when you have these systemic divisions that are a consequence of so many things that haven't been dealt with in that realm of trauma too, because ultimately it comes down to the person, the individual, as you were saying, you know, who can affect that change in the larger, you know, realm. Yeah. So yeah, just seeing that need for a healing that I, again, will go back. I feel that, you know, Jewish tradition has afforded a space. So whether you're talking about, you know, we have Yom HaShoah, we have Tish B'Av, you know, we have all, just to chronicle the whole scope of things that have been encountered by the people. So just to speak on that note of healing and the need for that.
Where do you live?
Yeah. Oh, I'm here in Los Angeles.
Los Angeles, okay.
Yeah, West LA.
West
So
LA.
yeah. So
Okay.
I look forward to talking more, and I will be very happy to communicate by email, and I will be able to crystallize some of these thoughts and just know how much I respect and appreciate you all.
Thanks, Mira. Give a kiss to the Pacific.
Oh, I sure will. It's warm and muggy today. We've had a hot past few days this July, so I will definitely give your regards and love to the Pacific. So,
okay.
But
Shalom.
all the best. Strength, shalom, shalom, and just
thanks for sharing, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, Myron.
Myron, thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Good day, good night.
Thank you, Shaul.
We Israelis will stay here. Oh, Shaul left. Hi, Hanan, how you doing?
Good.
Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem.
You were here the whole time, or just at
No,
the end?
I came late. I forgot about it, and all of a sudden something kafetz, you know, reminding me, but it was already half an hour late. I'm in the middle of trying to, it's a secret, but I'm letting you know. I had this feeling I have to leave. I'm on the Motzat Manalim of the kibbutz. Okay, it's like Kivichol above the Maskirut. It's supposed to be, you know, whatever, Motzat Manalim. And the last few weeks I said, I can't. With all the discussion about annexation and stuff, it's like created a new reality even though nothing's changed on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is that how do people relate to the real possibilities?
Mm-hmm.
So then I finally got convinced that the throwing in the you know, making a Hafganati kind of a, I'm leaving the Motzat Manalim and giving that reason, is not the Levinasian way of doing it. I mean, making a statement like that is taking a position of power. Even they're saying, "Oh, I'm weak. I really can't convince anybody." So So I decided I'm trying to make a nisuach of a hachlata Motzat Manalim, that Motzat Manalim will recognize the markiv of responsibility that comes along with Ribonut, and that our Ribonut comes from a Kodesh Baruch Hu and the Yi'ud of doing tzedek v'mishpat, etc., and therefore we recognize the I was going to say the zikah and the kesher, but maybe only the kesher of the Arabs in the area to their lands, and the necessity to provide possibility of maintaining and developing their farmlands for all Arabs who have land here, even if they're not living in Area C. And also the rights of, and the importance of developing, of establishing, and not establishing, looking for the word, levases, of like legalizing villages in Area C, and also providing room for development of Palestinian villages in Area B beyond their present boundaries, according to Tichnun v'Sudar, Mashu Kazeh, and see how the kibbutz deals with that resolution.
And then the purpose is that they throw you off the Moetzit Minalim?
Well, then, if they throw out the paper, then I would leave, I think, yeah. But it could be that it will, yes, be discussed in a way that could be meaningful. I mean, look at the fact that, from the kibbutz, maybe 30 or 40 people from the kibbutz answered that she'elon. Most people, and most of the people, like 80% of the people are talking about giving all of the Arabs who are living here, giving them either ezrachut or toshavut. So that's already, the fact that about 30% or 40% talk about giving them ezrachut.
Mm-hmm.
So that's already a state that's ritzini. And also the fact that a quarter of the people were against the Trump plan because it ignored the Palestinians, either as political partners or as people who have needs. That question should have really been divided maybe into two different possibilities. That also shows something. So I decided the right thing to do is to try to make this nisuach and make it a nisuach that'll be betzim meshakef hashkafat olam of the tzibur. Like,
not just a prophetic statement to get them to throw you off the board.
No, but in other words, to address them in their language. In other words, I talk about, Gush Etzion, Kfar Etzion is the first yishuv, and it was En Yoter TV me Chazara leGush Etzion, v'shavu banim legvulam, barovad ha'ishi, v'barovad ha'le'umi, b'lev ha'aretz, v'chol, all of the. So we'll see what's going to be with it.
Yashikoch.
Yeah. So be well.
Litot. Laila tot.